A candle burned, yet no flame was ever seen. Welcome to Echoes of Clues. I am your host, Shadow Teller. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I truly enjoy reading them. Into the mystery. The village of Bramblethorpe prided itself on knowing precisely what to expect of a Thursday afternoon. Thursdays meant the post at 11, the butcher's delivery at past, and on the third Thursday of June, the annual garden fete at Rosemead House. This year's fete promised nothing more scandalous than Mrs. Tregarron's rumoured decision to replace her famous seed cake with something modern, a development that had already caused a ripple of polite alarm among the parish ladies. Miss Jane Marple arrived promptly at 2 o'clock, wearing her dove-grey coat and a hat trimmed with artificial violets that had survived more summers than most of the village's younger inhabitants. She paused at the wrought-iron gate, taking in the scene with mild approval. Bunting strung a little unevenly, trestle tables sagging under plates of sandwiches, and the low, comforting hum of familiar voices repeating familiar opinions. Rosemead House itself stood serenely behind the festivities, an old red-brick building with white-framed windows and a reputation for discretion. It belonged to Mr. Lionel Harcourt, a man whose presence in Bramblethorpe was still spoken of with a faint curiosity reserved for people who arrive late in life and do not explain why. Mr. Harcourt, tall and silver-haired, was at that moment standing near the rose arbor, and smiling with practiced ease as he accepted compliments on his garden. "My dear Mrs. Peabody," he was saying, "the roses do all the work. I merely refrain from interfering." This remark was received with appreciative laughter, particularly from Mrs. Peabody herself, who firmly believed that interference was the only respectable form of gardening. Miss Marple drifted toward the tea table, exchanging gentle greetings. She noticed, as she always did, the small things, who spoke too loudly, who listened too carefully, and who smiled without warmth. Dr. Edwin Carlyle, the village GP, was frowning faintly at his cup as though it had personally offended him. Near him stood Pamela Reeves, Mr. Harcourt's niece, her pretty face animated, her laughter a little too quick. At the far end of the lawn, Sergeant Wilkes, off duty but never quite relaxed, was deep in conversation with Reverend Miles, whose clerical calm masked a lifelong enthusiasm for village drama. "All very pleasant," Miss Marple murmured to Mrs. Tregarron as she accepted a cup of tea. "Yes, for now," Mrs. Tregarron replied meaningfully, "though I always say these things have a way of revealing people's true natures." Miss Marple smiled. She had often found that to be the case. It was just after 3:30 during the cutting of the fete cake that the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon faltered. Pamela Reeves had been sent to fetch her uncle. "Uncle Lionel hates missing the cake," she'd said brightly, and had disappeared into the house. 5 minutes passed, then 10. At first, no one noticed. There was a speech to be made, a knife to be located, and a minor disagreement about whether the vicar or Mrs. Tregarron ought to do the honours. When Pamela returned, she was no longer smiling. Her face had drained of colour, leaving her freckles stark against her skin. She stood at the edge of the lawn, mouth opening and closing soundlessly, until at last a thin, trembling sound emerged. She began. "Something's wrong. Uncle Lionel, he won't wake up." The murmur that followed was like a sudden wind through dry leaves. Dr. Carlyle was the first to move. Miss Marple watched him cross the lawn with brisk efficiency, followed by Reverend Miles and Sergeant Wilkes. The rest of the guests hovered uncertainly, drawn toward the house by curiosity and held back by something like fear. Miss Marple remained where she was, setting down her untouched tea. "Too sudden," she murmured, and almost to herself. "Much too sudden." Inside Rosemead House, the air was cooler and faintly scented with beeswax and old books. Mr. Harcourt lay in the study, sprawled awkwardly in his armchair, as though sleep had overtaken him mid-thought. His eyes were closed, his expression oddly peaceful. Dr. Carlyle bent over him, checking for signs of life. His movements slowed, then stopped. "I'm afraid," he said quietly, "that Mr. Harcourt is dead." Pamela gave a small, choking cry and sank onto the nearest chair. "Dead?" repeated Reverend Miles. "But he was perfectly well this morning." "So he seemed," Dr. Carlyle replied. "No sign of a struggle, no injury that I can see." Sergeant Wilkes glanced around the room, his trained eye noting details even as his mind resisted their implications. A half-empty glass stood on the desk, its contents an amber liquid. Beside it, a candlestick held a short white candle, unlit but faintly misshapen, as though it had once been warm. Outside, voices rose as news filtered back into the garden. Shock gave way to speculation with remarkable speed. "A heart attack," Mrs. Peabody declared firmly. "Runs in families, you know." "Nonsense," said Mr. Collins, the retired solicitor. "Men like that always have enemies." Miss Marple listened as she joined the slow procession into the house. She paused at the threshold of the study, her eyes gentle, her manner unassuming. "What a dreadful thing," she said softly. "Poor Mr. Harcourt. Such a quiet man." She glanced, almost absently, at the desk. The glass, the candle, the scattered papers. Her gaze lingered for just a moment longer than necessary on the candle's warped edge. "On a candle that burned without flame," she murmured. No one heard her. The police would arrive soon, she knew. There would be questions and answers, and many things said that were not quite true. Bramblethorpe would be changed by the events of the afternoon, though by evening the bunting would still flutter and the roses would still bloom. Miss Marple folded her hands and waited. After all, she reflected, it was never the noise of a crime that mattered most, but the silences that followed. Within minutes, the house seemed to contract and fill, as though tragedy had a way of drawing people inward, compressing their voices and their steps into cautious, shared corridors. The garden fed outside continued in a strangled fashion. Someone had the sense to shepherd the children away from the lawn and towards the far end of the orchard where games could still be played without questions. But the air had changed. There were too many glances over shoulders, too many murmured consultations behind gloved hands. Sergeant Wilkes stationed himself in the doorway of the study with the air of a man trying to look as though he had done this sort of thing 100 times and failing only in the tightness around his mouth. "Best not to have everyone tramping in and out," he said, attempting a tone of calm authority. "Doctor's seen what he needs. Reverend, perhaps you might—" "I'll see to Pamela," Reverend Miles replied gently, already moving toward the girl who sat rigid in the chair by the fireplace. Though she had not cried again, her hands were clasped so hard that her knuckles looked bloodless. Dr. Carlyle, who had straightened from his examination with the briskness of a professional habit, drew Sergeant Wilkes aside. "No obvious sign of natural causes," he said in a low voice, his gaze flicking once toward the desk. "I can't say more without someone else having a look, but I wouldn't like to put it down to the heart without being sure." Sergeant Wilkes's eyes narrowed. "You mean—" "I mean I don't know," said Dr. Carlyle sharply. "But he looks too settled, you understand. And there's that." He indicated the half-empty glass. Wilkes moved closer to the desk and stared at it as if concentration alone might force the truth to rise out of the amber liquid. He did not touch it. There were rules, and there was also a vague sense that touching things made them real. Miss Marple stood slightly behind the cluster in the doorway, as unobtrusive as a piece of well-chosen furniture. She had made herself useful in the only way she knew, by being quiet, by being present, and by letting people forget her. Someone behind her, Mrs. Peabody, inevitably, leaned in and whispered with a thrill of catastrophe warming her voice. "Well, I said it. Enemies. Men who come to a place like this always have enemies, even if they smile politely." Miss Marple turned her mild gaze on Mrs. Peabody. "Do you think so, dear?" Mrs. Peabody's eyes glittered. Oh yes, especially with money. And he had money, didn't he? People don't buy houses like Rosemead on doctors' salaries. Mr. Collins, the retired solicitor, bristled near the hall table, as though eager to be consulted in his professional capacity. If I may say, Sergeant, he began. Wilkes held up a hand. Mr. Collins, we'll have an inspector here shortly. Meanwhile, I'd be obliged if everyone stayed where they are and didn't go wandering about. Mrs. Tregoran, could you keep your guests together? Mrs. Tregoran drew herself up, affronted in her very marrow. Rosemead House was not hers, and yet she felt personally responsible that it should not become a spectacle. I shall do my best, she said coldly, and proceeded to do it with the energy of a woman who had organized fetes through war years and parish disputes, and did not propose to be defeated by a corpse. In the drawing-room, people sat in stiff little groups, teacups still in hand, or as though their bodies had not yet caught up with what their minds were entertaining. The curtains were half-drawn against the late afternoon brightness, and the room took on an unnatural coziness that only intensified the sense of wrongness. Pamela Reeves remained by the fireplace, with Reverend Miles beside her, offering murmured reassurances that she seemed not to hear. Her eyes stared forward, fixed on some private image of the study and the stillness in the chair. You went in and found him, Dr. Carlyle said gently, crouching so that his face was level with hers. Tell me exactly what happened. Pamela's lips parted. I went to call him for the cake. He always came, even if he said he wouldn't. He liked being seen doing the proper things. The last words sounded half bitter, and she swallowed quickly. The study door was closed. That's not unusual. He likes quiet. Was it locked? Asked Sergeant Wilkes, who had followed them into the drawing-room after a last glance at the study. No, Pamela said. It opened at once, and he was just there. Her voice thinned. At first I thought he'd dozed off. I said, Uncle Lionel, and I laughed a bit because it felt silly, calling him that. Then I saw his face, and I knew. You know when something's wrong even before you touch them. Reverend Miles made a soft sound of sympathy. Miss Marple noticed how Pamela leaned very slightly away from him at the sound. So slightly that it might have been accident. Or might not. Was anyone with you? Dr. Carlyle asked. Pamela shook her head. No, everyone was outside. She hesitated and looked toward the window, out toward the lawn where bunting fluttered like careless flags. I'd been in the house earlier, though, before the cake. Mrs. Tregoran, seated nearby with an expression that suggested she would not let anyone forget that this was her feat, pounced on the detail. Earlier? Why were you in the house earlier, Pamela? Pamela's cheeks flushed. Because I needed a pin. My hat ribbon came loose. It kept slipping. I went upstairs to my room. You're staying here, Miss Marple said softly, as though offering a neutral fact. Pamela's eyes flicked to her, startled, then away again. Yes, Uncle Lionel insisted. He said it would do me good to be out of London for a bit. And was it? Miss Marple asked gently. There was a pause, just long enough to be noticed. Pamela's mouth tightened. I suppose. Sergeant Wilkes looked as though he wanted to ask another dozen questions, but the sound of a car crunching on the gravel drive cut him off. He straightened at once and moved toward the hall, relief and apprehension mingling in his step. When he opened the door, the late light spilled in behind a stocky man with a neat mustache and an expression of weary competence. Inspector Slack, Wilkes said, as if invoking an incantation. Slack's eyes swept the hall, taking in the gathered villagers with a practiced assessment that categorized them immediately into useful, irrelevant, and trouble. His gaze landed briefly on Miss Marple and slid past her with no recognition. Right, he said. Let's have it. In the study he paused, standing just inside the doorway as though measuring the room by instinct. He looked at Mr., Harcourt in the chair, at the desk, at the glass, at the small candle in its holder. "A candle?" he said shortly. "What for?" "No one lit it," Sergeant Wilkes said quickly. "It was like that when we came in." Slack walked to the desk and bent close, not touching but observing with the intensity of a man who believed in the eloquence of objects. The candle was short and white, its sides faintly rippled, as though heat had softened it once. The wick was intact, unburned, and yet the wax near the top had slumped and reset as if it had been warmed and then cooled again. Slack frowned. Odd. Miss Marple, standing just behind him, allowed her gaze to drift toward the mantel. There was a small silver tray there with an ash receiver and a matchbox, the sort of thing a man kept for guests who might smoke. The matchbox sat askew, and its cover slightly pushed back. From where she stood, she could see that one match was missing, only one. But the ash receiver was clean. Her eyes softened as though she had noticed nothing more remarkable than a dusting of lint on a cushion. "How curious," she murmured to herself, almost affectionately, as if speaking of a village child's peculiar habit. Only one match. Behind her, in the drawing room, someone was already beginning to whisper the inevitable question. Whether there had been anything in Mr. Harcourt's glass that ought not to have been there, and whether, perhaps, the candle that had not been lit had nevertheless somehow done its work. Miss Marple listened, and in the gentle tilt of her head there was the faintest suggestion that she was listening not only to what was said, but to what was avoided. But Inspector Slack did not ask for silence. He had long since learned that silence was a luxury one rarely obtained in a village. Instead, he simply began to speak in a firm, practical voice that made people instinctively hush, if only to catch every word. "Right. I want to know who was in this house today and when. Sergeant, you keep folk together in the drawing room. No one leaves Rosemead without my say-so. Doctor, I'll want your opinion as soon as you can give it." Dr. Carlyle nodded curtly, his face set. Slack's gaze fell once more on the desk. The half-empty glass stood beside a blotter and a neat stack of correspondence. The amber liquid caught the light and looked almost friendly, like sherry offered to an unexpected guest. "You say it was like this when you found him?" Slack asked Wilkes. "Yes, and Miss Reeves came to fetch him for cake. She found him—" Wilkes broke off, uncomfortable with the stillness in the chair. Slack bent, sniffed the rim of the glass with a faint wrinkle of distaste, then straightened again. "Smells like whiskey," he said. "Or brandy. Can't tell. Didn't spill. No struggle. That means either he took something without knowing it, or whoever did it was calm and close." He turned his head, eyes narrowing on the candle. "And this? Sergeant says it wasn't lit, but it's melted." Miss Marple's hands folded, her face composed. She might have been admiring the carving on the chair. Sergeant Wilkes gestured uncertainly toward the mantel. "There's a matchbox there. One match missing." Slack flicked his eyes to it at once, then back again. "One match. Nothing burned. Oh, that's another odd bit." He moved to the window and looked out across the lawn. The fete had been abandoned in spirit, if not in fact. Bunting still fluttered, plates still sat on tables, but the groups of villagers hovered like uneasy birds, their attention inevitably tugging back toward the house. Several faces turned up to the study window as Slack appeared there, and then turned away quickly, ashamed of their own curiosity. "You'll have to do," Slack muttered, and strode out. In the drawing room the atmosphere had thickened. It was no longer shock, precisely, but the sharpening of it into story. People sat with a kind of avid restraint, as though the first person to speak aloud, the suspicion forming in everyone's mind, would be guilty of vulgarity. Slack entered, removing his hat, and the whole room seemed to tense. All right," he said briskly. "I'm going to ask questions, and you're going to answer them. If anyone thinks they can be clever by holding back, they'll only make it worse for themselves." Mrs. Peabody drew in a breath as if about to offer herself as lead witness. Mrs. Tregarron sat rigid, prepared to ensure the village's dignity was not assaulted by improper policing. Slack's eyes settled on Pamela Reeves. "Miss Reeves, we've had your account. I'll come back to you. First, I want to know, did anyone see Mr. Harcourt after lunch?" There was a moment of hesitation, then voices. "I spoke to him at 2:30, Mrs. Tregarron said crisply. "He was arranging the raffle. He was in excellent spirits." "Not that it means anything," added Mr. Collins quickly. "Men can look in excellent spirits and be hiding—" Slack cut him off with a glance. Any disagreements? Anyone see him quarrel with anyone?" Pamela made a sudden small movement, as though she might speak, then stopped. The movement was tiny, but Miss Marple noticed it. Miss Marple noticed, too, that Pamela's fingers had found the edge of her skirt and were twisting it. "A quarrel?" repeated Mrs. Peabody, delighted. "Oh, well, there was that business with Mr. Larkin." "Mr. Larkin?" Slack turned. "The gardener," Mrs. Peabody explained, lowering her voice as though confiding some delicious sin. "He's been in a temper lately. You know what gardeners are like. They think they own the earth. I saw him speaking sharply to Mr. Harcourt near the potting shed only yesterday." "That's not true," Pamela said suddenly, and her voice rang out too loudly in the cramped, polite room. Everyone looked at her at once. She flushed again, but she did not retreat. "It wasn't sharp. Mr. Larkin was upset because the hedge was being cut back. Uncle Lionel wanted it neat, and Mr. Larkin said it was where the birds nested. That's all." Slack studied her, then made a note. "We'll speak to Mr. Larkin. Anyone else?" Dr. Carlyle cleared his throat. "I had a brief word with Mr. Harcourt around 1, he said. "Just after luncheon. Nothing unusual. He seemed perhaps slightly preoccupied, but no more than one might expect with a fate in progress." "Preoccupied how?" Slack asked sharply. Dr. Carlyle hesitated. "I couldn't say. He had letters on his desk. He mentioned something about sorting his papers." Slack's pencil paused. "Letters?" "Yes." Miss Marple's eyes drifted, almost lazily, to the edge of the room where Angela Barton sat very still. And Angela Barton was the village's quiet beauty, a widow not yet 35, with dark hair and a manner that suggested she was always slightly apart from what was happening around her. She had arrived in Bramblethorpe 2 years ago, purchased the small cottage at the end of Church Lane, and been politely admired without ever quite being absorbed. At this moment, her gloved hands rested in her lap. Her face was composed, but her breathing was shallow, as though she was counting it. Slack's gaze followed his own instinct and landed on her. "And you, Mrs. Barton," he said. "Did you see Mr. Harcourt today?" Angela lifted her eyes, and for an instant Miss Marple saw something dart behind them. A quick, bright flicker of calculation or fear. It vanished at once. "I spoke to him briefly," Angela said. "In the garden. He asked after my roses. That was all." Slack's pencil moved again. "What time?" "Perhaps 2:45, Angela replied smoothly. "Just before the cake business began." Pamela's head turned. She stared at Angela with a look that was oddly sharp, almost accusing, and then just as quickly looked away again. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Pamela's expression a moment longer than it did on Angela's. "And you were in the house earlier," Slack said, returning to Pamela. "Fetching a pin. Anyone see you?" Pamela shook her head, lips pressed tight. "No." "Anyone see anyone go into the house?" Slack demanded. There was an uneasy murmur. People glanced at one another, weighing the social risk of speaking too precisely. "I saw Mr. Raymond," said Mrs. Peabody suddenly, delighted to contribute. "Mr. Raymond from London. He arrived just after 2, didn't he?" "Well, he went straight in. Said he wanted to greet his old friend." A tall, lean man near the door stiffened. His suit was fashionable, his hair dark and carefully waved, and his face carried a slightly bored expression that did not quite mask an undercurrent of nerves. "I did," said Mr. Raymond. "I won't deny it. Lionel and I were acquainted years ago. I came down on business." His tone was light, but his fingers tightened on the brim of his hat. "What business?" Slack asked. "Financial. He consulted me from time to time. Investments." Raymond smiled faintly. Hardly the sort of thing one discusses at a fete. Slack looked as though he might enjoy discussing it now. "And you saw him in the study?" "Yes. We spoke for 5 minutes, perhaps. He offered me a drink." Raymond glanced toward the hall as if he could see the glass through walls. I declined. I had to speak to Mrs. Tregarron about the raffle. My wife is on the committee in town." The lie came too quickly, too neatly. Miss Marple's eyes lowered as though shy. She thought of the clean ash receiver and the single missing match, and of the candle that had softened without being lit. She thought, too, of how men like Mr. Raymond often used charm as a shield. Slack asked his next question with the bluntness of a man who had heard too many, hardly the sort of things. "Did you leave him alive?" Raymond's face tightened. "Of course I did. He was sitting at his desk, perfectly well." Slack's gaze sharpened. "Did you see anyone else in the house as you left?" "No," Raymond said. Then, after the slightest pause, "Only the maid, Mrs. Harcourt's housekeeper, Mrs. Gentry. She was in the hall." Slack nodded. "We'll speak to her. Now, anyone else? Anyone at all?" A small cough came from near the window. It was Miss Marple, apologetic, almost embarrassed at drawing attention. "Well," she said gently, "I did see someone come out of the side passage, near the pantry door, just before Miss Reeves went in. I thought it was one of the servants at first, but—" she tilted her head. "It was Mrs. Barton." The room went still. Angela Barton's face did not change, but her gloved hands, resting so calmly in her lap, closed very slightly, as though she had gripped something invisible. Slack's eyes fixed on her. "Is that true, Mrs. Barton?" Angela's voice remained smooth. "I did step inside for a moment. I felt faint in the sun. I asked for a glass of water." "A glass of water," Slack repeated. He glanced toward the study, and toward the whiskey glass on the desk that was not water at all. "And did you go near the study?" "No," Angela said. "Of course not." Pamela's breath came fast. Miss Marple could almost hear it, and beneath it, something else. The faintest sound of a matchbox cover sliding, not now, but earlier, in some quiet moment when no one was watching. Miss Marple lowered her eyes again and resumed the posture of harmless old age, while Inspector Slack's questions sharpened and the village's pleasant afternoon began to rearrange itself into suspicion. Inspector Slack let the silence sit a moment longer than was comfortable. He'd learned that people often filled silence with exactly what they had hoped to conceal. "Step inside for water," he repeated, still looking at Angela Barton. "Where did you go?" Angela's composure did not crack, but something in her eyes tightened as though she were calculating the safest path through a thicket. "Just the hall. I spoke to Mrs. Gentry. She brought it to me." Slack made a small gesture to Sergeant Wilkes. "Fetch Mrs. Gentry." Wilkes went at once, relieved to have something practical to do. In his absence, the villagers' faces shifted between curiosity and discomfort. No one liked being watched while someone else was accused, because it suggested they might be watched next. Pamela's gaze stayed fixed on the carpet, but her throat worked as she swallowed. Miss Marple, perched on the edge of a sofa, as though she might at any moment apologize for taking up space, watched Pamela's hands. They were no longer twisting her skirt. Instead, her fingers were pressed together as if she were trying to stop them from trembling. Slack turned to the London man. "Mr. Raymond, you said you declined a drink. Mr. Harcourt offered you whiskey." "Something like that," Raymond replied. He made an effort to smile, the smile of a man who believed charm should work even on policemen. Lionel was fond of his little comforts. Did he pour it then? Slack asked. Or was it already there? Raymond hesitated. I didn't pay attention. He moved toward the decanter. I told him no. Slack's pencil scratched. And you didn't see him drink? No. Did he seem ill to you? Drowsy? Confused? Raymond shook his head, a little too quickly. Not at all. He was Lionel. Calm, slightly superior. The last came out with a hint of resentment that surprised even him. Mrs. Peabody caught it like a scent. Oh, she said softly. So you weren't fond of him? Raymond's eyes flashed. Madame, I came here because he asked me. He wrote. He stopped abruptly, as though he had remembered the inspector's earlier interest in letters. Slack's gaze sharpened. He wrote to you? Raymond recovered. About business matters. Miss Marple's mild eyes flicked toward Dr. Carlyle, who was watching Raymond with a thoughtful frown, as if he had begun to suspect that business matters might include rather more than investments. Footsteps came briskly in the hall, and Sergeant Wilkes returned with Mrs. Gentry. Mrs. Gentry was a woman of about 55, neat as a pin, with grey hair scraped back into a bun that suggested she had never once allowed a hairpin to be out of place. Her face was pale, but her posture was rigid with the discipline of service. She looked as though she had been affronted not only by death, but by disorder. Yes, Inspector, she said. Her tone implied that if he meant to track mud on her carpets, he might as well do it quickly. Slack nodded at her. Mrs. Gentry, Mrs. Barton says she came into the house for a glass of water and you gave it to her. Is that right? Mrs. Gentry's eyes moved to Angela Barton with an unreadable expression. Mrs. Barton did come in, she said. She asked for water. And you gave it to her. I told her to sit in the hall a moment. I went to the kitchen. Mrs. Gentry's lips tightened. When I returned, she was not in the hall. Angela's chin lifted. I was near the pantry door. It was cooler. Mrs. Gentry gave the smallest possible sniff. I found her there, yes. I gave her the water. She drank it and went out again. Slack leaned forward slightly. Did you see her go anywhere else in the house? Toward the study passage? Mrs. Gentry's eyes narrowed, not in accusation but in careful recollection. No, the door to the study corridor was shut. Was it usually shut? Slack asked. Mrs. Gentry hesitated. Mr. Harcourt preferred it shut when he was working. But at a fete, well, people come and go. It might have been open earlier. And did you go near the study yourself this afternoon? Slack asked. Mrs. Gentry's mouth tightened further. No, Inspector. I had enough to do with the refreshments. Cook was complaining about the cream. A faint flush rose in Mrs. Tregoran's cheeks as though cream were a personal insult. Slack's eyes returned to Angela Barton. So you were unobserved for a few minutes. Angela held his gaze. If you mean I was not being watched like a criminal, yes. Pamela made a small involuntary sound. Half laugh, then half gasp, and pressed her fist to her mouth. Slack noticed it at once. Miss Reeves, he said sharply. You've something to say? Pamela's eyes darted around the room, trapped. No, Reverend Miles touched her arm gently. Pamela, if you know anything, I don't, she blurted. Her voice shook. She stopped, breathing hard, and then forced the words out more slowly. Mrs. Barton and my uncle they weren't strangers. That's all. The room drew in a collective breath. Mrs. Peabody's eyes widened. Not strangers. You mean... Pamela's cheeks burned. Not like that, she snapped, then immediately looked ashamed of the sharpness. I mean, she knew him before she came to Bramblethorpe. She wrote to him. She came because of him. Angela Barton's face whitened so quickly it was almost shocking. Pamela, she said softly, and there was an edge beneath the softness. That's quite enough. Slack watched them both, the air between them suddenly charged. Did you know Mr. Harcourt before you moved here, Mrs. Barton?" Angela took a breath. It was controlled, but Miss Marple saw the slight tremor in her throat. "I met him once," Angela said, "through my late husband." "Your late husband," Slack repeated. "And what did your late husband do?" "He was in the Foreign Office," Angela said, with the automatic chill of a woman used to deflecting questions. Slack nodded as though that explained everything and nothing. "And you wrote to Mr. Harcourt?" "Yes," Angela said. "I wrote because I was alone." He had known my husband. He was kind enough to suggest Bramblethorpe as a place to live. "A kindness," murmured Mrs. Peabody, savoring it. Slack ignored her. "Were you in financial difficulty?" Angela's eyes flashed. "No." "Then why choose a village where you knew no one?" Angela's gaze shifted, just for an instant, toward the window, toward the garden and the sunlit normality outside, and then back. "Because I wanted peace." "And did you get it?" Slack asked. For a heartbeat, Angela seemed about to say something raw and truthful. Then she smoothed it away. "Yes." Dr. Carlyle, who had been silent, suddenly spoke, his voice clipped. "Inspector, if we're dealing with poison, we should consider what could have been administered quickly. Something that could be placed in a drink." Slack nodded. "I've sent for the men from market basing. They'll take what they need." His eyes flicked to Mrs. Gentry. "Mrs. Gentry, who pours Mr. Harcourt's drinks?" "I do, when he asks," she said stiffly. Or he pours his own." "And would anyone else have access to the spirits? Decanter, bottle?" Mrs. Gentry looked faintly scandalized. "They're in the study cabinet, Inspector." Slack's mouth tightened, which anyone could open if they were in the study. Raymond shifted, as if the room had turned too warm. Pamela's breathing came fast again. Angela Barton sat very still, her hands clenched now in her lap without pretense. Miss Marple's gaze drifted away from faces and toward the ordinary objects of the drawing room. The vase of roses, the family photographs on the side table. None of them, of course, family in the true sense, for Mr. Harcourt had arrived alone, and a small silver bowl of mints set out for guests. One mint had been moved from the bowl to the tablecloth beside it, as if someone had taken it and then changed their mind. But it was nothing. It was the sort of nothing Miss Marple had learned to mistrust. Slack's voice cut through again. "We're not done," he said. "Not by a long way. And I'll tell you this. Whoever did this counted on the village being distracted, on people going in and out, on everyone minding everyone else's business and missing what mattered." His eyes swept the room, lingering on Pamela, on Angela, on Raymond, on Mrs. Gentry's tight face. "And someone," he added, "was in that study at the right moment. Someone who could leave without being noticed." Miss Marple lowered her eyes and let her face become pleasantly blank. But inside her mind, patterns were already forming. Not of chemistry or fingerprints, but of people. A young woman's sudden defensiveness, an older man's convenient vagueness, a widow's careful control, and a candle softened without a flame, as though warmth had been borrowed from somewhere else. Outside, a distant burst of children's laughter drifted from the orchard, incongruously bright. It made the stillness in the house feel even more oppressive. Miss Marple thought, not for the first time, how swiftly innocence and death could share the same afternoon. The men from market basing arrived with the subdued clatter of officialdom, boots on the gravel, murmured questions in the hall, the faint smell of damp wool and tobacco carried in on their coats. Rosemead House, which had always seemed to hold itself a little apart from village life, was now thoroughly invaded by it. Policemen in doorways, villagers clustered like uneasy furniture, and the invisible weight of a death that would not remain politely in the study. And Inspector Slack moved with new purpose once he had reinforcements. He sent Sergeant Wilkes to stand at the front steps and keep watch, and he ordered that everyone who had been at the fete should give their names and addresses to the constable with the notebook. It was all brisk, ordinary procedure. And yet every scratch of pencil on paper felt like the marking of guilt. Miss Marple, who gave her name in her small, apologetic voice, watched the list being made and could not help thinking how much more truthful it would be if it recorded not addresses, but resentments. Slack returned to the drawing room and pointed at Raymond. "Mr. Raymond, you'll come with me. I want to go over your movements again." Slowly. Raymond's mouth tightened. "Inspector, I have trains." "You'll miss them," Slack said flatly. "Nah, that can't be helped." Pamela made a faint sound that might have been relief or fear. Angela Barton's eyes followed Raymond as he left the room, her expression unreadable. Slack's next decision seemed almost casual. "Mrs. Barton, you'll remain here. Sergeant's man will want to speak to you again when he's done in the study." Angela's chin lifted. "Am I under arrest?" Slack's eyes were cold. "Not yet." Mrs. Peabody drew in a breath of satisfaction, then quickly covered it with a cough when Mrs. Tregoran shot her a look that could curdle cream faster than any kitchen scandal. Miss Marple remained on the sofa, hands folded, her mild gaze drifting from one face to another. Dr. Carlyle moved toward the window and stood looking out at the garden as though he might find an answer among the roses. Reverend Miles spoke softly to Pamela, and who sat as stiff as if she were being held upright by invisible pins. For a few minutes, nothing happened except the thickening of tension. Then the house seemed to exhale sharply. A constable came in from the hall, his cheeks red, his eyes uncertain. "Inspector," he said, and his voice had that faint tremor of a young man unused to death. "There's something in the kitchen you ought to see." Slack turned at once, irritation and alertness flickering together. "What now?" Well, sir, it's Mrs. Gentry. She says she found something. In the scullery." Miss Marple saw Mrs. Gentry's mouth tighten still further, as if she disapproved of being the bearer of new trouble. But there was also, beneath her stiffness, a gleam of something else. Vindication, perhaps, or fear. Slack followed the constable down the passage, and when several villagers instinctively leaned forward as if to follow too, then checked themselves under Mrs. Tregoran's censorious gaze. Miss Marple did not move. She listened instead to the faint echo of footsteps and to the way Pamela's breathing changed, quick, shallow, almost panicked, as soon as Slack left the room. Angela Barton rose suddenly. "Where are you going?" Reverend Miles asked, startled. Angela's lips tightened. "If I am to be questioned again, I should at least have a glass of water that doesn't involve being accused of stealing into cupboards." "No one's accusing you of that," said Mrs. Peabody brightly, which was precisely what it sounded like. Angela ignored her and moved toward the hall. Sergeant Wilkes's constable, stationed near the stairs, stepped forward. "Sorry, ma'am," he said awkwardly. "Inspector said—" Angela's eyes flashed. "Inspector said I was not under arrest." The constable looked helpless. Miss Marple, watching, saw the brief, sharp exchange not as a quarrel, but as a test, Angela measuring her boundaries, the police measuring her compliance. "Let her sit in the hall," Miss Marple said softly, as if offering a harmless compromise. Her voice was gentle enough to make it sound like concern for Angela's faintness rather than intervention. "It is rather close in here, isn't it?" The constable hesitated, then nodded, relieved to have permission from someone who sounded sensible. Angela went out, her shoulders rigid. Pamela's eyes followed her again, and Miss Marple noticed something new in Pamela's expression now. Not accusation, but a sort of frightened fascination. It was as though she were watching a door that might open on to something she did not wish to see. In the kitchen, Slack stood by the scullery table where Mrs. Gentry had placed a small saucer. On it lay a match, blackened at one end, the rest intact. Beside it sat a thin smear of softened white wax. Slack's eyes narrowed. "Where did you find this?" "In the scullery sink," Mrs. Gentry said stiffly. "I was washing up. It was stuck in the drain strainer along with that wax. Someone's tried to rinse it away. Slack bent close, his nostrils flaring slightly at the faint, acrid smell of burned wood. "One match missing," he muttered. "And here it is." The constable looked puzzled. "But, sir, if the candle wasn't lit—" Slack straightened. "That's the point. Something was heated. Enough to melt wax, but not enough to leave the candle burned." Dr. Carlyle, and who had followed them with the curiosity of a man who disliked mysteries he could not diagnose, frowned. "You mean the candle was warmed, not lit, held near a flame, perhaps?" Slack's eyes remained on the match. Or the match was used for something else, something quick. Miss Marple's voice, drifting in behind them as she had quietly made her way down the passage, was mild. "In the old days," she said thoughtfully, "people used to soften wax seals with a match, didn't they? Just for a moment, enough to press a stamp. Very convenient for letters." Slack swung his head toward her. "Letters," he said sharply, as if the word had bitten him. Miss Marple's expression was apologetic, almost shy. "Oh, I don't know if it's relevant, of course. But Dr. Carlyle mentioned Mr. Harcourt was sorting papers, and there is that candle on the desk. It reminded me." Slack stared at her, as though noticing her properly for the first time, not as a harmless village old lady, but as someone who had quietly deposited an idea into his hands. "You saw the candle," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, as if surprised he thought it worth mentioning. It looked as though it had been warmed, and the wick was quite untouched. Slack's mouth tightened. So someone wanted wax soft without flame. Why? Sealing letters, or hiding something inside wax? Dr. Carlyle looked startled. "Inside wax?" Slack's eyes remained hard. "Smugglers put things in stranger places." Mrs. Gentry drew herself up. "If someone's been doing anything improper with Mr. Harcourt's correspondence, Inspector, I can tell you this. There are letters missing. I don't like to say it, but it's true." Slack's head snapped toward her. "Missing?" "Yes," Mrs. Gentry said, and now her stiffness gave way to a kind of outraged certainty. "I tidied his study this morning. There was a stack of letters on the blotter. Opened, some not. He'd been reading them after breakfast. After the fete began, I didn't go in. But when the doctor asked for a cloth earlier, I looked in to fetch one and I noticed, well, the stack was disturbed. And there was a torn corner of an envelope on the floor. Only a corner." Slack's eyes narrowed. "Where's the corner?" Mrs. Gentry's mouth tightened again. "Gone. I looked after. It wasn't there." A door clicked softly behind them. Miss Marple turned her head and saw Angela Barton standing at the end of the passage, framed by the dim hall light. So she had not meant to be seen listening. Her posture suggested she had paused only because she heard voices, but now she was caught. For a fraction of a second, the composure slipped. Fear, pure, sharp, flickered across her face. Then it was gone, replaced by a cool mask. Slack looked at her, and his expression changed in a way that was almost imperceptible. But Miss Marple saw it, the narrowing of focus, the tightening of certainty. "Mrs. Barton," Slack said, his voice suddenly very quiet. "Come here." Angela did not move at once. Her fingers curled slightly, as if resisting an impulse to run. Then, with deliberate calm, she walked toward them. "What is it?" she asked. Slack held up the blackened match between finger and thumb. "This was found in the scullery sink. Someone tried to wash it away. Someone used a match in the house today." Angela's eyes flicked to it, and then away. "So?" Slack's gaze pinned her. "So tell me why, when we've got a candle melted without being lit and letters disturbed on a dead man's desk, you were the only person in the corridor, unobserved long enough to do something about it." Angela's voice remained even, but there was a faint, strained quality now, as if her throat had tightened around the words. "I told you. I came in for water." "And while Mrs. Gentry fetched it," Slack said, "you went somewhere she didn't see you go." Angela's eyes flashed. I stepped toward the pantry door. That is all." Miss Marple looked at Angela's hands. They were steady now, but the glove on her right hand was slightly smudged, just a faint dull mark along the thumb, though as if she had pressed it against wax that had not fully cooled. It might have been nothing. It might have been flour from a kitchen door, or it might have been exactly what it looked like. Miss Marple said nothing. Slack's voice hardened. "We'll see about that," he said. "Because someone in this house used heat for a purpose, and someone in this house moved letters on Mr. Harcourt's desk, and it won't take much to find out who." Angela's face remained composed, but her eyes did not. They flickered again, once toward the study passage, once toward the back door, as if mapping exits. Miss Marple watched her quietly, thinking of how people did not always kill out of hatred. Sometimes they killed out of fear, and fear, she had learned, was often far more dangerous than malice. Inspector Slack did not press Angela Barton further at once, but he had the instinct of a man who knew when to hold a line taut and when to let it slacken just enough for someone to stumble on it themselves. "Back to the drawing room," he said shortly. "All of you." Angela turned without a word and walked ahead of them, her back very straight. Miss Marple followed at a slower pace, her thoughts moving far more quickly than her feet. She was thinking of letters and wax, of a man who had been careful all his life and careless at the end, and of the curious way fear could make even sensible people behave foolishly. The drawing room felt different now. Something had shifted. Not relief, but anticipation. The villagers sensed that the story they would tell for years had just found a sharper outline. Slack waited until everyone was seated again. Then he spoke, his tone measured. "We've reason to believe, Mr. Harcourt was engaged in correspondence that concerned him. Letters have been disturbed. One may be missing, and someone used a match inside the house today for a purpose not yet explained." Mrs. Peabody clasped her hands. "Blackmail," she breathed. Slack ignored her. "Dr. Carlyle, I want you to examine the glass in the study as best you can for now. Tell me if there's anything you recognize. Taste, smell, residue." Dr. Carlyle nodded grimly and left at once. Slack turned next to Mrs. Gentry. "Mrs. Gentry, you'll stay available, and I want you to think carefully. Did you notice anything unusual in Mr. Harcourt's habits lately? Visitors? Late nights? Nervousness?" Mrs. Gentry hesitated, then said reluctantly, "He was distracted. More than usual. He burned letters in the grate one evening last week." "Burned?" Slack's head lifted. "Yes, not many. Just a few." Her mouth tightened. "He told me to mind my business." Slack's pencil moved again. "And did you?" Mrs. Gentry bristled. "Of course." Miss Marple's gaze softened. She thought of how often minding one's business was the enemy of truth. Slack's attention shifted abruptly to Pamela. "Miss Reeves, you said Mrs. Barton and your uncle were not strangers." Pamela flinched, then straightened as though bracing herself. "I didn't mean—" She stopped, then tried again. Uncle Lionel didn't speak much about the past, but when Mrs. Barton came to Bramblethorpe, he changed. He became watchful. "Watchful how?" Slack asked. "He locked his study more often. He told me not to go in there unless invited." Pamela's voice wavered. "And once I heard him arguing with someone in there, quietly, but very firmly." "Who?" Slack pressed. Pamela shook her head. "I don't know. I never saw them." Angela Barton's eyes closed briefly, as though in pain. Miss Marple noticed that Raymond, standing near the window under the watchful eye of a constable, had gone very still at Pamela's words. His jaw tightened, and he stared out at the garden as though wishing it would swallow him whole. Slack followed Miss Marple's line of sight. "Mr. Raymond," he said, "you were acquainted with Mr. Harcourt years ago. Did you correspond with him recently?" Raymond hesitated. "I told you, about business." Did you write to him? Slack repeated. Yes, Raymond said sharply. About investments. Did you threaten him? Slack asked, his voice flat. Raymond's face flushed. That's absurd. Did he threaten you? Slack countered. Raymond opened his mouth, closed it, then said tightly, he suggested certain consequences if I didn't cooperate. What sort of consequences? Slack asked. Raymond laughed shortly. Social ruin, professional embarrassment. He had a talent for making things sound worse than they were. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She thought of wax seals softened just long enough to press closed again, of letters opened and resealed, of secrets handled carefully until they were no longer manageable. Slack nodded slowly. And did Mrs. Barton figure in any of this? Raymond shot a look at Angela that was half anger, half appeal. No. Angela met his gaze coolly. You're lying, she said quietly. The word fell into the room like a dropped teacup. Slack's eyes flicked between them. Mrs. Barton. Angela's composure cracked, not shattered, but fissured. Her shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. My husband, she said, and now her voice had changed. My husband was ruined by Lionel Harcourt. A murmur rippled through the room. He was accused of something he didn't do, Angela went on, her words measured but burning underneath. Documents went missing. Letters were produced. Letters he never wrote. His career ended. He died a year later. Pamela gasped. Mrs. Peabody pressed a hand to her mouth in ecstasy. You believe Mr. Harcourt forged letters? Slack asked. I know he did, Angela said. He told me as much. When I confronted him, he said he had merely corrected the balance of events. Her mouth twisted. He was very proud of his cleverness. Raymond shifted. Angela, don't, she said sharply. Slack leaned forward. And you came to Bramblethorpe to confront him again? Yes, Angela said. He wrote to me. He said he wanted to put matters in order. I thought... Her voice faltered for the first time. I thought he meant to make amends. And instead? Slack asked. Angela's eyes flicked toward the study passage. Instead, I found he was still playing games, still holding letters over people, including Mr. Raymond. Raymond flushed. You don't know what you're talking about. Angela laughed, a short, bitter sound. I know exactly. He showed me one of them. A draft. He hadn't sealed it yet. Miss Marple's mind moved swiftly. A draft letter, unsealed, wax waiting to be softened. A match struck, not to light a candle, but to borrow its heat. Slack's voice was very quiet. Did you go into the study today, Mrs. Barton? Angela closed her eyes. As when she opened them, the mask was gone. Yes, she said. Pamela let out a small sob. I didn't intend... Angela began, then stopped. No, that's not true. I intended to stop him. I took the letter. I meant to destroy it. And the match? Slack asked. I used it to soften the wax on another envelope, Angela said. One he'd already sealed. I wanted to see what was inside. Her hands clenched. I found proof. Names. Ruin. He was going to destroy more lives. And then? Slack asked. Angela swallowed. He came in. He was furious. He laughed. He told me I wouldn't dare. Her voice dropped. He poured himself a drink. The room seemed to hold its breath. You poisoned it, Slack said. No, Angela said fiercely. I didn't touch the drink. I swear it. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Pamela, whose face had gone ashen. And Pamela was staring at Angela, not with hatred, but with dawning horror. Uncle Lionel didn't pour his own drinks, Pamela whispered. Not when he was upset. He always asked me. The silence that followed was profound. Miss Marple looked at Pamela with sudden, terrible clarity. The trembling hands, the sudden defensiveness, the frantic twisting of fabric. Slack turned slowly. Miss Reeves? Pamela shook her head, tears spilling freely now. I only meant to calm him. He asked for something to help him sleep. He'd done it before, just a little from the medicine bottle. I didn't think... Dr. Carlyle appeared in the doorway at that moment, his face grave. "Inspector," he said. There was chloral hydrate in the glass, enough to kill a man unaccustomed to it. Pamela gave a broken cry and collapsed into Reverend Miles' arms. I didn't know she'd be there," Pamela sobbed. "I didn't know about the letters. I only wanted it all to stop." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. There it was. Not a single act of evil, but a collision of secrets, fear and desperation. A candle warmed without flame. Letters opened without permission, and a young woman who mistook mercy for harmlessness. Slack straightened, his face grim but not unkind. "Miss Reeves," he said, "you'll have to come with us." Pamela nodded helplessly. Angela Barton sank into a chair, shaking. Raymond stared at the floor. Miss Marple remained still, her hands folded, her expression sorrowful but composed. Human nature, she thought, was very like village life. Everyone believed they knew it well, until one small disturbance revealed how little they understood at all. Now the formalities followed with a quiet inevitability, as though, once the truth had spoken its piece, there was nothing left to do but acknowledge it. Pamela Reeves was taken upstairs to pack a small case under the supervision of a matronly policewoman who spoke kindly and asked no questions. Angela Barton remained in the drawing room, pale and hollow-eyed, answering Inspector Slack's remaining queries with a weary precision that suggested she had already exhausted every emotion available to her. Raymond signed a statement with hands that shook only slightly, his relief tempered by the knowledge that relief, too, carried consequences. Miss Marple observed it all from her place by the window. Outside, the last remnants of the fete were being dismantled. Someone had begun to take down the bunting. The colored triangles sagged limply now, robbed of purpose. The children's laughter had faded, replaced by the practical noises of carts and footsteps. Bramblethorpe, which had held its breath all afternoon, was slowly allowing itself to exhale. Inspector Slack approached Miss Marple at last, his manner altered in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. The impatience had gone. In its place was a guarded respect. "You noticed things early," he said. The candle. The match. I didn't put much stock in it at first." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One doesn't need to put stock in such things," she said. "Only to remember them." Slack nodded. "You realized before the rest of us." "I realized," Miss Marple replied gently, "that more than one person was trying to stop Mr. Harcourt, and when too many people interfere at once, dreadful misunderstandings occur." Slack grimaced. Miss Reeves thought she was helping." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "That is so often the most dangerous thought of all." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as a constable escorted Pamela down the stairs. Pamela looked very young now, stripped of the brightness that had marked her earlier in the day. When she saw Miss Marple, she faltered. "I didn't mean to kill him," Pamela said desperately. "I swear it." Miss Marple reached out and took her hand. Her touch was warm and steady. "I know, my dear, but meaning is a poor shield against consequence. One must be very careful with remedies, especially when they are not one's own." Pamela nodded, tears spilling again, and allowed herself to be led away. Angela Barton rose slowly from her chair. She looked at Miss Marple with an expression that held both gratitude and reproach. You knew," Angela said quietly. "Before the end." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I suspected." "And you said nothing." "There was nothing to say," Miss Marple replied. "Not until everyone had finished telling their own truths." Angela gave a short, humorless laugh. "Lionel always said silence was a weapon." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but it is also a mirror." People see themselves in it, whether they wish to or not. Angela closed her eyes briefly. I wanted justice. And you nearly had revenge instead, Miss Marple said gently. The two are often mistaken for one another. Later, when the police cars had gone and Mead House stood strangely emptied of authority and accusation, Miss Marple accepted Mrs. Tregoran's stiff offer of a cup of tea. They sat together at the small kitchen table, now the ordinary comforts of china and boiling water reasserting themselves with quiet determination. Well, Mrs. Tregoran said after a moment, I suppose we shall all be talking about this for years. Miss Marple stirred her tea. I imagine so. And you, Mrs. Tregoran added, peering at her with a mixture of suspicion and admiration, you saw more than you let on. Miss Marple smiled. One always does, if one pays attention. Villages are very instructive places. Mrs. Tregoran sniffed. I shall never look at a candle the same way again. Nor letters, Miss Marple thought, nor kindness. That evening, as dusk settled over Bramblethorpe and the houses drew in their curtains one by one, Miss Marple walked home along the familiar lane. The hedges whispered softly in the cooling air. Somewhere a bird settled itself for the night, and everything looked exactly as it always had, and yet nothing was quite the same. She paused at her gate and glanced back toward Mead House, its windows dark now, its secrets finally laid bare. Lionel Harcourt had believed himself clever, had believed that control and concealment were the same thing. He had forgotten, as so many did, that human beings were not documents to be filed and sealed, but volatile creatures whose fears and affections could not be safely managed. Miss Marple reflected, not for the first time, that crimes were rarely born of a single wicked impulse. More often, they were the result of many small, well-intentioned decisions, each one nudging events a little further down an irreversible path. Inside her cottage, she lit a lamp and set the kettle on the stove. The flame burned steadily, honestly, illuminating the room without pretense. Miss Marple watched it for a moment with quiet satisfaction. Candles, she thought, were useful things, but only when one allowed them to burn as they were meant to.